Today's session is Best Practices for Producing Outstanding Image Quality Results. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, Lou Prestia, Senior Product Line Manager, and Heather Blakely, Product Marketing Specialist. We have a lot to cover, so Lou, let's begin. Take it away.
Thanks, Yael. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining the session today. As Yael just described, we're going to talk about optimizing image and vector quality for digital print in today's session. The things that we'll talk about in our session start with digital imaging basics. I want us to understand and have a common understanding about the elements that make up a page before we talk about how to optimize the quality of these page elements. We'll then spend a fair amount of time talking about image quality, since this is often a big challenge with selling digital print jobs, or any kind of print jobs for that matter. We'll learn some tools and tricks for evaluating image quality around these key areas of tone, color, and detail. From there, we'll move into a discussion about vector graphics and quality challenges with vectors, mainly around gradients and also edge detail. We'll talk also a little bit about challenging objects like very fine lines and fonts and kanji characters and some things that are often difficult to reproduce on a digital device, and we'll share some information about tools that can be used to make these things print better. We'll close today's session by talking about PDFX4 workflow, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but once we get our images and our vectors right, the next place where print problems come in has to do with how we assemble the page and what techniques or tricks the designer may use in designing the page. So I want to talk a little bit about a workflow that avoids a lot of those pitfalls. Heather will share some resources for you after the main part of the session, and then we'll move into Q&A. So the first thing to talk about is page components and what's in a page. A page is typically composed in a software application like Adobe InDesign. And in InDesign, when we create a page or a designer creates a page, they're typically assembling a number of elements. Those elements fall into three basic categories: images, vector graphics, and fonts. When we talk about images, images are what we sometimes call bitmaps or rasters. And if you think about it, the Fiery or any other digital front end for your digital presses is partially a RIP, a raster image processor. So it's easy to remember rasters. The raster image processor converts the whole page into one big image for the printer, but we're not there yet. Right now I just want to focus on the element of the page called a raster or an image, and remind you that images have limited resolution for enlarging. So if I look at the image on this page and I zoom into it, as you've probably seen many times in Photoshop or an application like that, I can see the pixels in this picture when I zoom in enough. The pixels, which is short for picture element, are the little dots that comprise the photo. Might be from a scan of a conventional photograph, or more typically today it's the resolution at which we took the digital photograph creates these pixels that compose the image. Vector graphics, or what are just sometimes called graphics, are different than images. They're not composed of pixels. Vectors are described using mathematical formulas. So we might have 2 points with a line between them, or we might have some kind of a curve defined by a spline function, or a path created of lines and curves that might represent some object. Because vector graphics are mathematically defined, they're infinitely scalable. So I can create a little circle in an application like Adobe Illustrator. Maybe I make a circle that's 2 centimeters in diameter. We can take that circle and enlarge it up to the size of a bus wrap or a building wrap, and the circle, provided we use the vector, will still be tack sharp. There's no concern about, do I have enough pixels in my vector? This is an example of the vector from the page I showed you earlier, and again, typically it's Adobe Illustrator that we use to create and manipulate our vector elements. The last component of the page is fonts. Fonts are essentially a special case of vector graphics. These too are defined mathematically using lines and splines. Fonts also are infinitely scalable. The reason we treat fonts differently is because a font set contains a whole set of glyphs, which is to say a whole set of vector graphics for all the characters in that font. Fonts also have licensing associated with them, and for this reason fonts are typically handled differently both in application software and to a certain degree when we're in a print workflow or a digital front end for a press. Now that we understand the basic page components, let's talk about how we optimize the quality of these components. The first thing I want to talk about is images. And the first question is, why do images need correcting in the first place? Well, even before we get into printing and challenges with printing, photographs naturally suffer and have conventionally suffered from a whole plethora of issues related to the photographic process. What sort of film did I use? How did I process it? How old was the film? What temperature did I store the film at before I shot it and after I shot it before I processed it? All these things related to the problems with conventional photographs. Film and emulsion challenges aside, I also had challenges with conventional photographs just based on the same things we see today: exposure and aperture and the lighting conditions in which I shot the photograph. So when we move to looking at digital photographs, we have a different set of problems, some of these related to the sensor, but many still related to exposure and other settings on the camera, and so we can see problems such as a color cast that I'm showing here. And this is a classic example of the picture on the left is the one that I thought I was taking, and when I get the prints back from the lab or the print out of my digital press or look at something on the back of my camera, I see instead that I've captured this thing at the right, which has a pretty pronounced red cast. When we evaluate image quality, we need to consider these three key areas about the quality of the image reproduction. The first is tone. The tonality of the image is adjusted with our tone controls in various places in the workflow we'll discuss. Tone has to do with how light or dark the image is, and this is the first thing we must evaluate when we do color correction. The second thing we consider, of course, is the color. Here we might adjust color balance if needed, as in the example I showed you in the last slide. There's some other special corrections we do, and we'll touch briefly on those. Finally, we'll talk about detail. For an image to look natural and to look believable, which is a classic test I use when I look at a printed image, a believable image has to be sharp. It has to look like the real world. And the way we get the right amount of detail in an image is to make sure we have enough image resolution in the first place, then to apply some tricks like unsharp masking, and also to consider how we're going to halftone screen the print before we print it. So to talk about tone, again, tone refers to the lightness or darkness of the image at specific tone ranges. The easiest way to tell you to think about tone is to ask you to pretend that the print you're looking at is black and white. Okay? If we get confused and start talking about the reds and the blues and the yellows and what we want to do to all these colors, we've typically missed the first and most critical step in image correction, which is tone adjustment. If you can step back and think about the image as a black and white, and either think about the believability of the image, or more typically, we're trying to do some sort of a copy match. Maybe I have the original photograph that I'm trying to match, or I have a proof or some other sample that's been provided that I want to match on my digital print. In order to make that match, the first thing I need to adjust or consider is the tonality. When we talk about tone, we usually manipulate tone in the graphic arts using a tone curve. And the tone curves that we see on cameras and other digital capture equipment typically don't look like this one that I'm showing you at the left. A classic tone curve that describes the relationship between the input, such as the photograph, and the output, which is the press, usually has a convex shape to it. That is, it's usually bumped up in the middle. And the reason for that is that in the original capture of this image, I need to do tone compression. And that steepness of that original curve in the highlight areas gives me the contrast and the believability that my eye is going to need when I see the final print. Once we've captured the image and I'm looking at it in a tool like Photoshop or like the Fiery Image Viewer that's part of the Graphic Arts package, I'm looking at a straight tone curve. Because at this point I just want to change the relationship between the input and the output. So if you want to think about a tone curve, especially when you see one that's linear like this, the x-axis across the bottom of this curve represents the input. So it might be the percent dot area in your print file. So you measure some bright blue object and it has 100% cyan, that would be all the way at the right of this scale at the bottom of this graph. The vertical axis, or the y-axis, represents the output. It's the percent dot that will print on the press. So the way the curve is set up right now, if I had a 50% input dot in the middle of the bottom axis, I'd print it at 50% because I'm halfway up the vertical axis. When we make tone adjustments, we typically need some language to talk about how to manipulate the tone curve. And while we don't usually manipulate this, a description of tonality and tone curves would be incomplete without sharing with you the highlight and the shadow. So the highlight is where the image data starts, the brightest point in the original. If we're capturing an original with a camera or a scanner, then we typically define the highlight as the brightest point in the original that has detail. So it's technically what we call a diffuse highlight. The highlight, naturally, is at the lower left corner of this curve where I'm at 0% in, 0% out. Now the real highlight of the image is not where I'm showing that highlight point, but it's up maybe 2 or 3% wherever my press can start to hold dot. The next step up the scale is the quarter tone. The quarter tone represents, on our in equals out graph, approximately 25%. And if I look for a quarter tone in an image, then I'm looking for tonality like what I'm showing you in the front of this building. The mid-tone, halfway between the highlight and shadow, represents the middle of the tonal scale. The three-quarter tone moves us towards the shadow of the scale. Essentially, the mid-tone, the three-quarter tone, is halfway between the mid-tone and the darkest point, which naturally we call the shadow. So when I describe tone corrections, or when I look at an image and something I'm trying to match and I see a tone problem, you're likely going to hear language like, make the mid-tone darker, or make the quarter tone lighter. When I need to adjust tone, there's some different tools I can use. Curves are the most traditional way. Again, these are available in the Fiery Image Viewer, but they're also in Photoshop and a number of other image editing applications out there. I can also use levels, which many of you may be familiar with the levels control, which shows me a histogram of the image and lets me adjust the placement of the endpoints, the highlight and shadow, and typically the midtone on the levels control. Curves gives me a little bit finer degree of adjustment, especially in the quarter tone and three-quarter tone. So if I make a correction to an image with a tone curve, and again I'm pretending my image is black and white since we're talking about tone, I'd expect to see a change like this if I lighten the quarter tone. Everybody see that? I've made pretty abrupt changes in the presentation today so that it will go over the WebEx, so it may not look great on your screen, but just want to give you the idea. This is what opening or lightening the quarter tone looks like. Now, let's talk about how this relates to color and why I'm telling you that we need to adjust the tone first. If I open the quarter tone on this image, the appearance is like this. I'll go back and forth for you a few times. Okay, so notice that the quarter tone areas, the areas halfway between the highlight and the mid-tone, are getting significantly lighter. And again, I've made a pretty abrupt change here. It's a 6% change. In practice, I'd probably start with more like a 3 to 4% change, so it's not too much of a change in the print. But I want you to look at one other thing here. When I go back and forth, look at the blue boat. Look at the front of the red building at the left. Look at the greens in the trees and the umbrella. Notice how the colors are becoming more saturated? That's interesting, isn't it? We mainly focused on adjusting tone to get the tonality believable and matching to the original scene, but we actually see the colors changing. Why would that be? The answer lies in the way that printing inks and photographic emulsions conventionally work. The relationship of colors in a bright, what we call a saturated color, is defined that the wanted components are high and the unwanted components are low. So we need to know what wanted and unwanted components are. Let's just think about the red brick building. In a red color, the wanted components are what? They're magenta and yellow. And if I look at this tone curve that shows me the whole range of tonality, where would these colors be? Well, magenta is going to be all the way up here at the end of the curve. It's probably at 100% in a red, very close to it. Yellow, the other wanted component, is going to be somewhere around the shadow between the 3/4 tone and the shadow. In a bright red, probably at about 80%. What about the unwanted components? The unwanted component in a red is cyan. Cyan sits here at the 1/4 tone. So now you can see that when I open the 1/4 tone, or lighten the 1/4 tone, the cyan moves and the yellow and magenta do not. Okay? This is an advanced concept, so if you're struggling with it a little bit, we're going to send you a link in our thank you email that you'll get in a few days, and I've created a video on YouTube. You can hear me talk about this at greater length if you want to understand more. Before I go on though, we're going to talk about color now. I want to remind you that the tonal correction I made fixed a whole range of colors in my images. It fixed all the saturated colors by properly establishing the ratio of the wanted to the unwanted components. Now we're ready to look at color. Color is, of course, the first thing the eye focuses on when we look at a digital print that is color. And if we've corrected the tone first, we've fixed some of the color problems, maybe with saturation, but we probably need at least one more adjustment in a bad print or a bad photograph. And that's a balance correction. Color balance is adjusted from the neutrals. We'll look at this in a moment. And generally, once I've fixed the tonality and the color balance, 90 to 95, more even 98% of my images are properly corrected and will print with high quality. There's one area of special correction called selective color correction that I'll talk about for a minute, since a color correction session would not be complete without it, but we really rarely use that control. When I want to adjust color balance, or what we traditionally call cast, so you might have heard me say earlier that the image I showed you in the image problem example had a red or a magenta cast, means it has too much magenta. I'm going to use the same controls. I'm going to use my curves. This time, I'm going to use a curve that is just for the magenta channel. So remember, when I adjust the tone curves, I move the cyan, magenta, and yellow, and actually the black channel too, all at the same time. That's why we saw that relationship between wanted and unwanted components change. If I want to fix the magenta cast in this image, the place that I need to look is in a neutral. Now this is a very extreme example, but imagine you have a photograph, or maybe a print of a photograph, that you're trying to see if it looks natural, or you're trying to correct to satisfy a print buyer. Chances are there's something neutral in that image. Might be a person in a piece of white clothing, might be a street, so pavement on the street is often very gray. Number of other objects we can look for that are neutral, whether they're in the highlight or darker areas we would call maybe a gray. All I'm going to do once I have my neutral is I'm going to take the magenta curve. Now I've made a less extreme example for you so you can see what's going on here. And I'm going to pull it out of the 1/4 tone, which is typically where my cast is. Remember, you can identify a cast by measuring a neutral color in a tool like Photoshop or Image Viewer. It should have a certain ratio of cyan to magenta to yellow. Typically the cyan is the highest, the magenta and yellow are a little bit lower. So that ratio changes through the tonal scale. That's called gray balance. But to give you a general idea, if I measure a 1/4 tone neutral and it has 25% cyan, I'd expect that it'll have about 19 or 20% magenta and yellow. The midtone, the ratio would be more like 50% cyan to 40% magenta and 40% yellow to make a gray. So if I measured a neutral in this picture, and I'll go back and forth for you a little bit, and I had 25 cyan and 23 or 20, whatever I said, magenta, and 30 yellow, if I had 25 cyan and 23 or 22 or 21 yellow, but the magenta is at 30, then I found my color cast. I'm simply going to pull this back to correct that cast. Okay? What color might that fix? It's going to correct neutrals. Clearly, we're looking at the neutrals, so that's very obvious. They're going to render closer to gray without the color cast. What about saturated colors? Isn't there a color that has magenta in the quarter tone? That would be the greens. So when I have a magenta cast and I pull the magenta out as I showed you, I have this relationship in a green color. Cyan and yellow are wanted. They're at the end of the curve that I didn't move. When I open the curve for the magenta to pull out that cast, I'm actually also fixing the saturation of the greens. The last correction tool for color that I want to talk about is selective color correction. Selective color correction is a traditional control. It allows me to adjust color within a color. So maybe I want to take cyan not out of the quarter tone for the whole image, but I just want to take cyan out of reds, for instance. There's a couple of ways I can apply this. Photoshop has excellent selective color controls. We also have it in a profile editor from the Fiery Color Profiler suite. But I want to highlight for you here that almost the only reason I would ever do selective color correction is for a print buyer preference. Okay? So I make a print, I look at it, maybe it doesn't look natural, or maybe I have some copy to match and it's not matching. I go back and I fix the tone, I fix the color balance, I make another print. You've all been in this situation. The art director says, well, that's perfect. But look at this red apple here. The red needs to be just a little bit more shapely. It's a little bit too bright looking. Can you put some cyan in the red? Certainly you can. You go use selective color correction. Photoshop, there's a number of other ways you could do this, but the important thing to understand is that we're not going to go make a mask around that apple in some image editing application. We're going to use a global control, selective color, that lets me adjust one color within a color. So just for an example here from Photoshop, I've decided that I want to put more magenta into my cyans. Sorry, take magenta out of my cyans. If I go back and forth here, look at the boat, the front of the picture, look at the sky, the building to a certain degree. Magenta is just coming out of those specific colors. Okay? There's a much more refined way I could do this by picking a more narrow band of color than just saying cyan, but I just want you to get the idea of selective color correction. The last area of image quality is detail. When we look at the detail in an image, we look at how sharp it looks and how natural it looks, and we have three things to contend with. The first is the original sharpness of the image. That is to say, did we have the picture in focus when we took the picture? The second challenge is that when we print an image, we halftone it, right? We convert a continuous tone original into little halftone dots for the printing press. Those halftone dots, by definition, are not touching each other in most tonal ranges. That means we're sacrificing some level of detail in the halftoning process. In order to get detail to render properly on a digital print, or even conventional any print, I need two things besides a focused photograph to start with. I need to have enough resolution in the image to fill the area that I'm trying to print with it, and I probably need to apply some digital sharpening, what we call Unsharp masking. When we talk about resolution, or what I have always called enough data to go the distance, we think about images in terms of pixels per inch. Pixels per centimeter is fine too. What I don't want you to say is DPI, or dots per inch, because DPI is very confusing. My printer has a certain DPI, my monitor has a certain DPI, right? The way to think about how this image is going to print is to think about how many pixels I got from the camera or scanner and how big I'm trying to print those pixels. So let's do a simple calculation. Let's say I have an image on my page that's 2 by 3 inches at 300 pixels per inch. I want you to ask yourself, how many pixels are there in each dimension of this image? In the 3-inch dimension, if I have 300 pixels for each of those inches, I'm going to have 900 pixels. In the 2-inch dimension, at 300 ppi, I'm going to have 600 pixels. Great. So if I have an image that's 900 by 600 pixels, and I want to print it 2 by 3 by 2 inches on my page, it's going to have excellent detail. Like that. Here's what happens. The designer, or somebody somewhere in the production process, gets this file, and somebody says, oh no, we need to fill up something on that page. Take this other object out and make that picture bigger. They don't go back to the original photograph to resample it in a different way in Photoshop. They may not even have it. Instead, they stretch it out in the design application. Let's say we stretch that out to 9 by 6 inches. What's my new pixels per inch? Well, let's remember, in the 9-inch dimension, that used to be 3 inches with 300 pixels in each inch, so I had 900 pixels. If I take 900 pixels over 9 inches, I'm down to 100 pixels per inch. Same way with this other axis. What happens when I go below a certain threshold PPI is I get pixelation. Pixelation is where the halftoning process reverses itself and the pixels show. Rather than the halftone dots showing me the detail in the image, the halftone dots show me the pixels. Okay? A good rule of thumb for best practice is that you should always have 300 pixels per inch. In reality, you can get away with as little as 150 or 200 pixels per inch if you must, but you're not going to get the same kind of sharpness and quality that you will at 300. Before I go on, I want to say one other comment here. People get very confused around this topic because they'll come to you and they'll say, well, you have a 600 DPI press there. That digital press is 600 DPI, or your inkjet or whatever it may be. You're going to print a 300 PPI image on there and expect it to work? Absolutely. We're going to halftone it. We're going to use the high resolution of that printer to form the halftone dots, not to render every single pixel of the picture. We can't do that, right? We need to halftone in order to print. One way I can solve a pixelation problem on a digital front end is to use a feature like image smoothing. So on the Fiery DFE, we have a feature called smoothing. Smoothing resamples the data for you because you don't have access to the original file maybe to go get more pixels. You're not going to get the same level of image sharpness, but it will eliminate pixelation. So I see this here. I can enable image smoothing in the job properties, and I can take an image that looked like this, and I've zoomed in quite a bit for you to see it, and convert this image so that it looks like this. Still doesn't look great. It's not sharp, but it's no longer pixelated. And if it's a small object in a picture, such as this is, it's probably not going to bother the print buyer as much as pixelation. The other thing we do to give better detail when we print is we apply Unsharp masking. Unsharp masking sharpens the edges of images, and it is a technique that came from camera back separation years and years ago. So just to give you a moment of history here, Unsharp masking is called this because when we made camera back separations, we would basically shoot 4 halftones of the color original. We'd shoot a picture or a halftone with a red filter. That would make the cyan film. Then a green filter for magenta, blue filter for yellow, and we'd use a special filter for black and neutral density. Finally, we'd take a 5th exposure. We'd make a 5th halftone film, and that film would be out of focus. That was called the Unsharp mask. If you think about a blurry photograph, If I had a blurry photograph in front of you and I cut a hole in a paper napkin so that you can only see one little circle on that photograph at a time, if I showed you a smooth area of the photo, you wouldn't be able to detect the blur. But if I move that hole in the napkin over an edge in the photo, might be the edge of an object or a person's hair or something with contrast against the background, there you see the blur. So the Unsharp mask basically photographically identified the edges. And when we made contacts of those halftone films, we'd use the Unsharp mask to give us extra dot growth and extra hardness of those dots at the edges to enhance contrast of those edges and what appears to be detail. Today we do this digitally. We apply what's called a black line and a white line at the edges, which simply means if I have a boundary between a light and a dark object, I'm going to draw an extra light line of pixels on the light side of that boundary and an extra dark line of pixels on the dark side of that boundary. I'm really not giving you more sharpness, but I'm enhancing the contrast of edges. Whenever we adjust Unsharp masking, we should remember to consider the final result. So if you're zoomed out, so that the thing is tiny on your screen in Photoshop or some other tool, you're going to probably adjust the sharpening wrong. If I want to see what's going to happen with sharpening, whether I'm in Photoshop or maybe a tool like our Image Enhanced Visual Editor on the Fiery, I need to make sure that I'm zoomed into 100%. Also consider your output size and screening. If I'm using a very coarse halftone screen, that is a low LPI screen, I might want a little more sharpening, or I might need a little more sharpening than if I'm using a higher LPI screen, like in the 100 to 200, 300 range. Remember too that the output size is going to matter. If I sharpen an image for a poster and then I print it as a postage stamp, the smaller reproduction is going to look too contrasty. The edge lines will be too big. So here's an example of digital Unsharp masking. I've just created a black and white sample here for you, a grayscale sample, that shows different levels of difference between the edges. And I've applied truly a massive amount of Unsharp masking so that you can see this on the WebEx. But what you see is that there is an extra dark and an extra light line drawn on each side of these borders, okay? And I have a control over the radius of that border. Usually I use just a couple of pixels. I made this extra wide so you can see it. And I'll go back and forth. We see that Unsharp masking gives greater edge enhancement where there is greater contrast and lesser edge enhancement where there's lesser contrast. So this helps us to keep the photograph looking natural. Before we move on and talk about vectors, I just want to share with you a couple tools if you don't want to worry about all the things we just talked about. And these are tools for automatic image correction. So if you have a high volume workflow, you're not going to adjust every picture, right? If you have a workflow that has images which I politely say have varying degrees of quality, which means maybe some of these are snapshots somebody took at an office party that are going to be in some print you have to make, automatic image correction is an excellent way to go. We have the Image Enhance feature on the Fiery, again, something that I enable in the job properties. Image enhancement does a whole range of things, and I'm not going to show you the controls, but it can adjust the tonality, it can adjust color balance, it can adjust color saturation, and it can actually automatically fix things like red eyes that might be a problem in a photograph. We let you access this in a second way. The Image Boost preset, which you can download at this URL that I'm showing here, and which we'll share with you in the resources at the end, is a preset for the Fiery that automatically turns on both the image enhancement and also the image smoothing that we looked at earlier that helps you out if you have images of low resolution. So what tools should you use? That's certainly up to you. If you have control early in the workflow, you might use tools like Photoshop. If you're trying to fix things at the press, tools on the DFE make a lot more sense. Before we go there though, let me remind you that all this begins with a properly calibrated and profiled press. If you're not calibrating your digital press, if you're not creating profiles for your individual press on the paper that you or your customers choose for you to print on, you're not going to get good quality results. You can do all the adjustments in the world. You might even get a job to look good. You know what the problem is? You're going to have to do a bunch of adjustments on the next job, and it's very hard to be profitable in that fashion. So as I said, problems with design elements we might adjust upstream. If we're downstream at the press, we're probably going to look to DFE-based tools. And I talked about some of these so far. The image viewer curves I showed. There's also controls for brightness and the image enhanced visual editor. Okay, let's talk for a few minutes about vector graphics quality. There's really two challenges with vectors. Gradients. You might have expected a gradient to look one way and it looks another when you print it. And edge detail. I have this vector. Lou told me on that webinar that it was infinitely scalable, but when I print it, it looks all jagged like this. It looks totally pixelated. What's happening here? The first thing, if you have a gradation that looks like this in the design application and prints like this, is you have banding. Basically, you have a problem with the gradation where the colors are changing too much for the amount of levels of gray that I have on my press. Two ways I can work with this. The first way, if we're designing, we can try to constrain the size of the vector. Vectors under 7 inches really tend to reduce this problem. Okay, remember the problem is that I need the tones to change smoothly over certain physical distance. If I don't have enough levels of gray over that distance, then I get these bands. So if I keep that small, that's a great solution. You're all looking at the phone saying, yes, but I don't have any control over how the designer creates their gradation. So this is just one tip. The other tip we can use for design, or for trying to troubleshoot a design, is we can try not to blend from a very dark color to white, or to a very light color. And the best practice we say here is to make sure two components are changing by at least 50%. Now you don't always have this control, but if you do have some control or way to adjust it, and you can just change the endpoints a little bit so that two colors are changing. In my example here, magenta and yellow are both changing by 50%. That's going to be a very safe gradation for me to print. Guess what? There's also a tool on the DFE we can fix this with. Fiery image smoothing that I talked about not only enhances images by resampling them so that pixelation does not occur if they're under a threshold level of pixels per inch, image smoothing also adds additional smoothing to blends and gradations. So I might have a gradation that looks like this, and I could use the image viewer tool to see this if I wanted before I printed. Turn on the image smoothing, and now it looks like this. Okay? The second problem is with edge detail. I am very serious when I say vector graphics are infinitely scalable. It's a little bit hard to show you on the WebEx since we're all looking at this on a screen, but I want to highlight the problem. The problem mainly with logos is that you didn't get a vector in the design in the first place. If you don't have an EPS or a PDF or an Illustrator or an SVG object, and even PDF's questionable whether it's really a vector, then what you have is an image. Very common for somebody to take a logo off the internet. It's not a graphic anymore, it's an image. And sure enough, when I print that image, especially if it's 72 DPI that I took off some website, it's going to look terrible in print. Okay, it's going to look very pixelated compared to printing the real vector. Okay? Incidentally, before I go on, you may, on my screen, see a color difference. So another important thing to understand is that when I create a logo that's my brand, and I define it as an EPS file or a PDF file, maybe SVG, I carefully define the colors in there, often using spot colors, so that it looks consistent from my business card to my letterhead to all the different applications of my logo. As soon as I start grabbing images off the internet, as you see here at the bottom, I'm not going to have that same rigorous treatment or definition of the color. The last problem we deal with in print, in terms of quality of vectors and images, relates to fonts and sometimes fine line vectors. Okay? Not all controllers have the same level of control for this. There's different edge enhancement features on different Firies and different digital front ends you may have for your digital presses. But I just want to show you an example what some of the Fireys have, which is called HD text and graphics, and this is just a couple before and after samples, okay? This is a really, really hard thing to print. It even on the right doesn't look that great, but if you look at the left, when I get down to 3 and 2 point, especially in those kanji characters, I can't even read it without this edge enhancement applied. This is another good example of the HD text and graphics feature. Okay, so let's put this all together into a page. When we put together a page, we know now that we will have images and vectors and fonts. We know, hopefully more now than we did at the beginning of our session, more about how to evaluate the quality of an image reproduction and how to correct it. Also, we understand some of the problems that can happen with vectors and how we can design differently or adjust things differently or use DFE settings to smooth out vector gradients. So here's my page. There's two other things I want to cover just briefly here. The first one is overprinting. So this goes back to the early days of Adobe Illustrator and the PostScript language. If the designer overlaid two objects like this and they wanted them to blend together, they'd set a characteristic on the top object called overprint. Okay, and that lets us see through there. In newer applications, we have controls for transparency. So I can blend those two colors together much more sophisticated way than just the simple overprint. I can blend them with all different levels of opacity. Remember too that the designer doesn't always consciously use transparency. They go into their layout application and they do something like this drop shadow here. This drop shadow is going to use transparency in the page definition, that is in the PostScript or PDF that I create, in order to render this effect. So I always have to deal with not just getting the images and vectors and fonts right, but also making sure that I have the right tools and controls to get my overprints and my transparencies to print correctly. Complicated problem? Good news is I have a relatively simple solution for you. PDF workflow. So let's compare just for a second the difference between the Command P workflow, or Control P, or what we call the print workflow, which you may be doing now. When I say print from any of these applications that I create layouts in, or designs in, I have a whole range of settings. Guess what? All of these settings, and I'm just showing you a subset here, can spoil your print. Okay? Remember that unless you have just one digital press and one operator, if you're using a Control P workflow, and you carefully watched everybody on every shift, they all probably have their own favorite ways of setting some of these things, which means one job prints well and another doesn't print well, or a problem you've probably encountered where a job printed great and the customer loved it, they come back for a reprint and you can't make the reprint to save your life because something in this very complicated world changed. Consider the alternative. Less clicks for one thing. If I say export in InDesign, or if I'm an illustrator, I can just save. Illustrator naturally writes PDF files. I will export a PDF X4 file. PDF X4 was defined in 2008 by the Ghent Working Group to properly define not just color spaces, which they've always done in these PDF X's, but also proper handling for overprints and especially transparencies, which is your biggest challenge today. So if you choose this workflow, export PDFs, enable some kind of an automated workflow such as with hot folders, process everything as PDF, probably using the Adobe PDF print engine if you have that, the APPE on the digital front end. This is one way to minimize a lot of problems which you can't really control. There's no way I can teach you about how to look at a transparency and adjust it for tonality and color balance and solve a print problem. So just a moment. I try not to talk too much about product in these sessions, but I did want to point out that if you choose to do the PDF workflow, and you have certainly one of the newer Fireys since 2012, there was a test of PDFX done with a bunch of digital front ends, number of presses and digital front ends, and in 2012 the Firey was awarded this level of qualification called perfect. Okay? No other digital front end in the world has ever achieved this perfect qualification when they were offering it. All the presses they surveyed, or digital front ends rather, either didn't get any mark at all, or they got a passing mark. In this case, we got the perfect mark on the Fiery. So any of your newer Fiery System FS100 or later have this perfect PDF characteristic. All right, let's review. Today we talked about digital imaging basics, how we compose a page from images, vector graphics, and fonts, a little bit about each of those things. We learned about image quality and how to adjust image color quality, first by adjusting tone, the lightness and darkness of the image, then with color adjustments, which might include color balance or cast correction, again typically using the curves, might also include some selective color correction for a particularly picky customer, but very rare that we should have to use that. Finally, for an image to look proper, it needs to have the right level of detail. That means I need to have enough resolution in that image for the size at which I want to physically print it on the page. And it also means I probably need to apply some enhancement, usually unsharp masking, which is an edge enhancement that gives us the illusion of greater detail, or greater contrast really in the image. We talked about vector graphics, biggest challenge there being with the gradients, and we showed you some design tips to make better gradients, but also the trick with image smoothing to fix problematic gradients when we print. We looked at edge detail on graphics and logos, which is kind of a hard problem to fix, but just one that you need to be aware of. There's some things that you're going to have to go back upstream in the design process to get fixed if you want them to print right. And we looked at fine lines and fonts and some special features that are offered on certain Fieries to render some very challenging tiny type and very fine lines correctly. Finally, we talked about a workflow to get everything to print correctly, and that's the PDF X4, probably in some sort of automated workflow, both to save you time and energy, but also to give you more consistently good print quality over time. I want to turn it over to Heather here to talk to you for a few minutes about our resources.
Great, thank you, Lou. So we have many great resources available to you, including other color-related webinars that cover color fundamentals, spot color matching, and the importance of color standards. So you can view these recordings of these sessions when we provide you with direct links in a thank you email that will be sent to you in a few days. So be sure to register for other future World of Fire webinars that help keep you up to date with the latest color technology and color trends to help keep you successful. So on May 27th, we will cover the color fundamentals for wide format. And then on July 15th, we explain how you can achieve great output with your paper. So be sure to register today for the upcoming webinars at efi.com/WOF webinars. Be sure to check it out, our Fiery Global University e-learning courses at training.efi.com to enhance your Fiery product knowledge and productivity. We have put together a specific e-learning bundle for you comprised of courses covering Command Workstation, Graphic Arts Package Premium Edition, and PDF workflows. So you get all of these courses for free until the end of August, and we will send you the details of how to enroll soon. Download and install the Image Boost preset that Lou mentioned earlier on your Fiery server to be able to apply it to all of your print jobs to automatically produce better looking images, as described earlier. You can download this preset at efi.com/imageboost. We have also produced a new video that describes the tone curve adjustments in further detail that you can watch to learn how it changes color, since we couldn't cover everything today. And then also be sure to download guidelines to properly print PDF X4 documents that include overprints and transparencies on your DFE. And as always, you have access to our Fiery online resources with everything you need to do more with your Fiery products, including software downloads, training resources, and more. So once again, all of these links will be provided to you in a thank you email that you will receive in a couple of days. So now we will go ahead and get started with our Q&A.
Great, thank you, Heather, and thank you, Lou. We do have some questions started, so we'll have Lou take a look at these and start answering these. Before we do that, I want to reiterate, we did record this session. We had a few questions from people. We will send out a link to the recording probably next week. As many of you know, we have a holiday coming up in the US that will maybe delay it by a day. But you will have the link to the recording, a link to the presentation, links to all the resources Heather just covered. So lots of great stuff for you to take advantage of, and of course the e-learning bundle, which you can start anytime between now and the end of August. So with that, I want to start with the questions. If we have enough time to stick around a little bit more, you're welcome to stick around with us. We'll see how we do with these questions and getting to all of these. So you're welcome to stay with us. We might extend by a few minutes to get to more of these. So Lou, let's just get going.
Okay. So the first question I see here, and it's a good one, says, should fiery option called image smoothing be left on all the time, or should I just use it in special cases? And the answer is it depends a little bit on your workflow. If you see a lot of these problems with resampled images and gradients not being smooth, I'd leave it on all the time. As with many things on the Fiery, this feature doesn't do any harm, but it does mean that it takes us a little bit longer to process a job. Now remember, the Fiery drives engines that are well over 100 pages per minute, so unless you're in that very top class of users, you probably don't mind the small performance impact image smoothing would give you, so I would recommend you enable it all the time. And you can do a test to find out about that. Okay, the next question is comment about the levels of Unsharp masking I'd use for different output technologies such as inkjet versus offset lithography. And the answer is it depends. It is true, I would say, that for offset you need more sharpening than for let's say an inkjet. Depends on your inkjet. If it's a production inkjet and you're printing at 360 dpi, then that might be different. It's a really hard question to answer. In general, the only way to properly adjust Unsharp masking is to look at the image at 100% on your screen, make it look a little bit too sharp, and then print it. My experience is that I can sharpen an image and print it across a range of technologies, including an aqueous inkjet, a grand format-like device, and an offset press, and a digital cut sheet narrow format device, and it looks about right on all of them. I might do a little bit of extra sharpening, and if I'm printing particularly low res on grand format, and I might do a little bit less sharpening if I was printing just specifically on a very high resolution aqueous inkjet, but I don't usually have that level of control over the image. So I'd recommend sharpen it in Photoshop at final size at 100%, a little bit more than it needs, and that should be fine. If you're using Image Enhanced Visual Editor on the Fiery, same rule applies. Just sharpen it a little more than you think it needs on the screen, and that typically looks great in print. Next question regarding fonts and vectors. Is it better to convert fonts to outlines prior to sending to print? The reality is the digital front end converts your fonts to outlines anyway. The reason we historically outlined fonts, especially in vectors, is because we wanted to send the vector to somebody and not have to give them the font, or they didn't have the font. So it's still kind of a best practice, because you won't find that somebody has to chase after you for a font if you don't convert it to outline. It's not a necessity, but I'd say probably still a good idea if it doesn't take too much extra time. It means that anybody can print that job, and if you think about it, it's a very reasonable way to consider fonts, since if I own the font, I can use all the different glyphs at all the different sizes. If you create a design with a font that you own and outline it and send it to me, then I don't really need to own that font, since I can't use any of the other characters or sizes except the one you outlined for me. Okay, the next question is, two questions. Best PDFX version for digital printing, which would be PDFX4, it's the latest. There's another question about the difference between PDFX4 and PDFX 1A, I think is what this is. So quick Ghent working group history, the people that make these specifications. PDFX originally came because we had problems printing PDF files. Okay? PDFX1 and X1A, and I forget the exact difference, basically specified that you could only have process colors. So it got you out of the business of having your offset, the RIP for your image setter back in those days crash because you had RGB in the document. It also eliminated spot colors, so that all spot colors had to be converted. Again, eliminated the problem on your conventional RIP where you got an extra film or an extra plate off the plate setter, and you went, what's this, Pantone 484? They're not paying me to print Pantone 484. So X1A got you to strict CMYK. PDFX3 allowed spot colors and a few other more sophisticated features, and again, very rigorously specified, like X1A did, how overprints had to work with different color spaces and different object types. PDFX4 is just the next level, and it's only PDFX4 that considers transparency, which is this not new thing. We've been doing it in Photoshop for 20 years or so, but it is new in that it's easy to apply in the design applications, and it's used by a lot of special effects in design applications. So many print problems today are related to the use of transparency. PDFX4 specifies how to create that transparency in the PDF, and then of course if you have the digital front end that has a qualification like that 100% perfect pass, that means we know what to do with that stuff to print the transparency very well. Okay, next one is also transparency related, seeing transparency boxes around icons when I print. Does not appear on print ready PDF. Exactly the problem, it's transparency. I'll give you an easy and a hard solution. The easy and best solution, if you have it on your Fiery, and I don't know if you do or what kind of digital front end you have newer Firies in the color controls have a checkbox that says optimize RGB transparency. That would fix that problem probably. Worst case, you could make a PDFX4 and send that to a APPE enabled digital front end. Should solve the problem. That wasn't the worst case, sorry, that's the middle ground. Worst case, you could print from the driver. Remember, when you print from the driver, Acrobat flattens everything. It just takes absolutely forever, and you run into that issue that I said where one operator sets the print dialog different than another, and you don't have real good reproducibility. A copy of the webinar with original audio will be available in the thank you email. We'll give you a link to that. Someone asked if they could have that. So there's a good question here, and I'll be really honest because I want to address it. An iGen 150 customer has a set of presets for InDesign for submitting PDFs to iGen. Would the PDFX4 be better than what they provided? We're going to owe you an answer on this. It's a good question. We have to look at what they provided. I bet they just extended PDFX4 to send it to the Fiery, but we can take a look. Seeing darker blocks, another transparency issue, I believe. Darker blocks printing on areas with transparency effects. Can't see them on screen but show up on prints. Yes, try exporting a PDFX4 and printing it. And if you have APPE, try enabling APPE. Let's talk for a minute. There's two specific Fiery questions that I want to address. This is related to one of them, and then there's another. The first is, how in the world do I print with this APPE thing that you talk about, Lou? The answer is, if your Fiery has the Adobe PDF print engine, which is on all the external Fiery servers, you won't have it if you have an embedded, you will need to go to the configure from Command Workstation. That's the web configure, and in configure you can tell it to enable APPE. Once it's enabled, you'll see at the top of your job properties a checkbox that says APPE preferred or use APPE preferred, and if you set that you get APPE. The other Fiery specific question, and I again tried not to talk too product specifically here, but I did talk a few times about the image viewer, which is the tool for viewing final rasters before you print them on the Fiery. It's pretty much our best troubleshooting and diagnostic tool that we have in the whole realm of Fiery technology. That's part of the Graphic Arts Package Premium Edition. Naturally, somebody said, how do I know if I have this Graphic Arts Package Premium Edition? A little more detail. It is part of Graphic Arts Package Premium Edition. It is also often part of the Productivity Package if you have an embedded, that is a non-external server Fiery. The way you find out is to launch Command Workstation, go to Device Center, General, and on the right you'll see all your features. If it says Productivity Pack, or if it says Graphic Arts Package Premium Edition, then you have these things. The other way you can find out is to just grab any ripped and held job on the Fiery. That is a job that has been put in the hold queue that has already been processed. So it has a raster. If you right-click on it and you see the command or the choice to pick the image viewer, then that means you have this package. The HD text and graphics, another similar question. HD text and graphics is also located within job properties on the image tab. If you're not seeing it, it probably means that your Fiery may not have HD text and graphics. There's a whole realm of other edge enhancement choices on different Firies, and it's more than we can cover in our time today. But if you put a question up on the Fiery forums, someone can help you with your specific press and Fiery with what your options are for edge enhancements. So the question is, in graphic art package, where do we adjust tone and color balance? The answer is the tool I just talked about. If you launch the image viewer, in image viewer you have curves, and you can either move all the curves together, that's tone, or you can deselect some and move just individual curves, and that would be your color balance. Good question here. This customer says their Fiery has a 1200 DPI setting. Will this help with gradients? Well, classically, this would help with gradients. If you were at an image setter or a plate setter, you were imaging at 2400 DPI, going to higher resolution like 3000 DPI would definitely give you more levels of gray, depending on the halftone screen you were using, and could help with gradients. On digital presses, this isn't always clear. So it really depends a lot on the halftone screen and the DPI setting. I would look at the screens that are available at 600 and 1200 DPI, and if you have one of the Firies that when you set it to 1200 DPI, the names of the halftone screens are things like sharp text or CAD drawing, then that's not going to help you with gradients. You'd be better off using a smooth screen at 600 DPI, probably a dot screen, or something that says something about smooth images or smooth gradients. The screens often have names like that. Point of clarification here, someone is saying they've gotten conflicting advice. They use APP as a default. Some people say it should not be set. I believe it should be set. I not only want you to set it, if you set it and you have any problems at all with the way things print, we want to hear about that immediately so we can fix it. And the forums are a great way to start that conversation on the Fiery forums. The reason you're hearing conflicting advice, I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit here, but I believe you're getting conflicting advice because early implementations of APPE didn't work particularly well. And I don't want to point fingers here, but it wasn't the Fiery implementation that was responsible or that was solely responsible. APPE is a pretty new technology from Adobe. We're only up to version 3, I think. So the early APPE just didn't always do things right, and so some people had problems, and you may be hearing from people that have older Firies that had older APPE, and they say, oh, that doesn't work. If you have a newer Fiery, say FS100 or later, certainly FS100 or newer, APPE should work pretty flawlessly for you. Okay, question here about color, kind of a little bit off topic, but I'll take it. Is Grackle the best standard for digital printing? Oh, I get in big trouble if I say that because there's people from all over the world on this call. Grackle is a great appearance matching definition. Okay? Is it a standard? Kind of. The standard really has some other ISO name. If you're printing on high quality coated paper in the US, Grackle is a great thing to standardize on. If you're not printing on a high quality coated sheet or a thick coated sheet, you may not be able to achieve the gamut of Grackle. Don't kid yourself when you're printing on uncoated paper or plain paper and say you're running Grackle. You can't hit the gamut on that paper. Therefore, a good standard for you might be Swap 3 or even Swap 5 if you're in the US. If you're in Europe, these numbers are all different, these definitions. Generally, the answer is the same. On a high quality sheet, I definitely standardize on ISO coded V2, the Fogra 39L dataset. And if I'm on uncoated, I'd go to some Fogra uncoded standard probably.
So let's take a last question, and we'll close for today and get back to the rest of the folks individually.
The question I'm going to take is problems with Pantone colors used with transparencies causing transparency rip problems. I have not heard specifically of that. Certainly that's a possibility. I guess I'd have a couple of things I'd suggest you try. First thing is, Make sure that you're printing it as a Pantone color. That is, make sure it has the right name in the file and it's being picked up by the Fiery or by your DFE. Good way to trick that is to go change the definition of the Pantone on the DFE to some completely opposite color, make a test print. Did the color change? Good, then you're using spot colors. Then the next set of advice is all the same things for transparencies. Try going to PDFX4, processing with APPE, seeing if that resolves the problem. Enable the checkbox if you have it on your Fiery to optimize RGB transparency. And finally, in the worst case, you could print from the driver if it's just one job that you need to get out. If you continue to have problems, this is another great one. I know I keep saying this. Put this up specifically on the color forum. Number of different forums on the end for the Fiery. Put it on the color forum, and our experts will take a look and probably ask you for some sample files and see what we can do to make things work better for you.
All right, so we do have a bunch more questions we're not able to get to today. We want to respect everybody's time, although we've already run about 10 minutes late. I appreciate everybody who stayed with us. To reiterate, we have recorded links to all the resources, the recording, copy of the presentation, all that good stuff will be made available to you with our thank you email. Expect that next week. Early to midweek. We'll do our best to get it to you as soon as possible. I know some people are always anxious to get it, so we're going to do our best. We do have another great session that may be of interest to you next week. We'll go through some color management fundamentals. There is going to be some level of focus on a wide format, but I think that if you want some color management fundamentals in general, it might be a good session to join. So check that out. It's on our website. You can go to efi.com, find our webinar calendar. It's there. It's also off of the landing page where you registered for today's session. You'll be able to find a link there. So with that, I want to thank our presenters, Heather and Lou, for taking the time today to provide all this great information. And I want to thank you, our audience, for joining us, providing all these great questions. And we hope to see you on the next one. Take care.